Session 835. Jane was very relaxed before the session. Okay, I'm going to start with Chapter 6, heading as given last time. There is an enchanting suggestion solemnly repeated many times, particularly after the turn of the century. Every day, in every way, I am getting better and better. This might sound like a bit of overly optimistic, though maybe delightful, nonsense. To a degree, however, that suggestion worked for millions of people. It was not a cure-all. It did not help those who believed in the basic untrustworthiness of their own natures. This suggestion was far from a bit of fluff, however, for it could serve, and it did, as a framework about which new beliefs could rally. We often have in your society the opposite suggestion, however, given quite regularly. Every day in every way, I am growing worse, and so is the world. You have meditations for disaster, beliefs that invite private and mass tragedies. They are usually masked by the polite clothing of conventional acceptance. Many thousands may die in a particular battle or war, for example. The deaths are accepted almost as a matter of course. These are victims of war, without question. It seldom occurs to anyone that these are victims of beliefs, since the guns are quite real and the bombs in the combat. The enemy is obvious. His intentions are evil. Wars are basically examples of mass suicide, embarked upon, however, with all of the battle's paraphernalia, carried out through mass suggestion, and through the nation's greatest resources, by men who are convinced that the universe is unsafe, that the self cannot be trusted, and that strangers are always hostile. You take it for granted that the species is aggressively combative. You must outthink the enemy nation before you yourself are destroyed. These paranoid tendencies are largely hidden beneath man's nationalistic banners. The end justifies the means. This is another belief, most damaging. Religious wars always have paranoid tendencies, for the fanatic always fears conflicting beliefs and systems that embrace them. You have occasional epidemics that flare up with victims left dead. Partially these are victims of beliefs, for you believe that the natural body is the natural prey of viruses and diseases over which you have no personal control, except as is medically provided. In the medical profession, the overall suggestion that operates is one that emphasizes and exaggerates the body's vulnerability and plays down its natural healing abilities. People die when they are ready to die, for reasons that are their own. No person dies without a reason. You are not taught that, however, so people do not recognize their own reasons for dying, and they are not taught to recognize their own reasons for living, because you are told that life itself is an accident in a cosmic game of chance. Therefore, you cannot trust your own intuitions. You think that your purpose in life must be to be something else or someone else than you are. In such a situation, many people seek out causes and hope to merge the purposes of the cause with their own unrecognized one. There have been many great men and women involved in causes to which they gave their energies, resources, and support. Those people, however, recognized the importance of their own beings and added that vitality to causes in which they believed. They did not submerge their individuality to causes. Instead, they asserted their individuality and became more themselves. They extended their horizons, pushed beyond the conventional mental landscapes, driven by zest and vitality, by curiosity and love, and not by fear. Many people lost their lives recently in a tragedy of Jonestown, Guyana. People willingly took poison at the command of their leader. No armies stood outside the grounds, no bombs fell. There was no physical virus dial spread through the multitude. There was no clothing to decorate mechanisms of events. Those people succumbed to an epidemic of beliefs, to an environment that was closed mentally and physically. The villains consisted of the following ideas: that the world is unsafe and growing deadly, that the species itself is tainted by a deadly intent, that the individual has no power over his or her reality, that society or social conditions exist as things in themselves, and that their purposes run directly counter to the fulfillment of the individual. And lastly, that the end justifies the means, and that the action of any kind of God is powerless in the world. The people who died were idealists, perfectionists of exaggerated quality, whose very desire for the good was tainted and distorted by those beliefs just mentioned. For those beliefs must gradually shut out perception of good from experience. Man is of good intent. When you see evil everywhere in man's intent, in your own action and in those of others, then you set yourself up against your own existence and that of your kind. You focus upon the gulf between your ideas and your experience, until the gulf is all that is real. You will not see man's good intent, or you will do so ironically, for in comparison with your ideas, good in the world appears to be so minute as to be a mockery. To this extent, experience becomes closed. Such people are frightened of themselves and of the nature of their existence. They may be intelligent or stupid, gifted or mundane, but they are frightened of experiencing themselves as themselves, or of acting according to their own wishes. They help create the dogma or system or cult to which they fall prey. They expect their leader to act for them. To a certain extent, he soaks up their paranoia until it becomes an unquenchable force in him, and he is their victim as much as his followers are his victims. In the Guinea affair, you had red-blooded Americans dying on a foreign shore, but not under a banner of war, which under certain circumstances would have been acceptable. You did not have Americans dying in a bloody revolution, caught among terrorists. You had instead Americans succumbing in a foreign land to some beliefs that are peculiarly American and homegrown. Beside the list given earlier, you have the American belief that money will solve almost any social problem, that the middle-class way of life is the correct democratic one, and that the difficulty between blacks and whites in particular can be erased by applying social bandages rather than by attacking the basic beliefs behind the problem. Many young men and women have come to adulthood in fine ranch houses in good neighborhoods. They would seem to be at the peak of life, the product of the best America has to offer. They never had to work for a living, perhaps. They may have attended colleges, but they are the first to realize that such advantages do not necessarily add to the quality of life, for they are the first to arrive at such an enviable position. Their parents have worked to give their children such advantages, and the parents themselves are somewhat confused by their children's attitudes. The money and position, however, have often been attained as a result of the belief in man's competitive nature, and that belief itself erodes the very prizes it produces. The fruit is bitter in the mouth. Many of the parents believed quite simply that the purpose of life was to make more money. Virtue consisted of the best car or house or swimming pool, proof that one could survive in a tooth-and-claw world. But the children wondered, what about those other feelings that stirred in their consciousnesses? What about those purposes they sensed? The hearts of some of them were like vacuums waiting to be filled. They looked for values, but at the same time they felt that they were themselves sons and daughters of a species tainted, at loose ends, with no clear destinations. They tried various religions, and in the light of their opinions of themselves, their earlier advantages seemed only to damn them further. They tried social programs and found a curious sense of belonging with the disadvantaged, for they were also rootless, the disadvantaged and the advantaged alike, then joined in a bond of hopelessness, endowing a leader with a power they felt they did not possess. They finally retreated into isolation from the world that they knew, and the voice of their leader at the microphone was a magnified merging of their own voices. In death, they fulfilled their purposes, making a mass statement. It would make Americans question the nature of their society, of their religions, their politics, and their beliefs. Each person decided to go along on that course. Still talking about that Jonestown. End of the session unless you have questions. Do you want to say something about Jane, I asked. Seth promptly came through with 2 lines of encouraging material for her. Then, end of session. Okay. I'm still that way quite a bit, Jane said as soon as she came out of trance. She referred to her very beneficial and relaxed condition. Right now, my right temple, my right knee, and my right foot are all going whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And I can add that her relaxed state enhanced her session material each time. Notes. Seth cited the same famous autosuggestion from the work of the French psychotherapist Emile Q in Chapter 4. And then, as now, he was correct for the first 2 words. He should have said, day by day, in every way. I am getting better and better. Let's skip down a little bit. Jane laughed when I asked her why she hadn't told me of her feelings about Jonestown before. You never asked. She hadn't meant to be secretive, she added, but had simply accepted her attitudes as being based upon her own strong beliefs. The mass deaths at Jonestown took place during our long layoff from book dictation, but Seth began discussing the affair almost at once in our private material, as Jane described in her own portion of the opening notes of session 831. Now she told me that Seth introduced the subject in that manner so that later she'd be more at ease dealing with it for mass events. Session 840. Almost 5 weeks have passed since Seth gave the 835th session. He's come through with 4 more sessions since then, too, the last 3 of them growing out of the unexpected death of our young cat, Billy, on February the 28th. Let me try to put that unhappy event in perspective now, in the continuing chronology of our lives as they are enmeshed in the Seth material in general, and in mass events in particular. First, on February the 12th, 5 days after the 835th session was held, Jane and I received from Prentice Hall the page proofs for Volume 2 of Unknown Reality. Checking those 499 pages word for word against our carbon copy of the original manuscript called for the most demanding concentration on our part for the next 13 days. When I arose early on the 26th so that I could wrap the proofs for mailing, however, I noticed that Billy didn't appear to feel well. Jane watched him while I went to the post office. He was no better when I returned, and as the morning passed we came to realize that he had a urinary problem. That afternoon I took him to the veterinarian, who kept him for treatment. The problem was serious. By then the cat was in great pain. Jane and I both wondered, why Billy? Why should such a seemingly perfect young creature suddenly become that sick for no observable reason? We were shocked, no doubt about it. I wrote in my notes for the 836th session, a private or non-book, one that Jane gave that evening. During the session, Seth discussed Billy's illness to some extent, while also giving the first installment of an answer to a long-standing question of mine. I was curious about the relationship between the host, whether human, animal, or plant, and a disease it might contract, one that was caused, say, by a virus. I'll return to the question at the end of these notes. On Tuesday, the veterinarian told us by telephone that Billy was better, that probably I might take him home the following afternoon. I was to call before making the drive across town, though. Wednesday afternoon, then, an hour before I was due to check, the phone rang. The thought of our vet flashed into my mind naturally enough, and it was he, regretfully explaining that Billy had died an hour or so before. The doctor had left the office to make a call. When he returned, he found Billy dead in his cage. He didn't know why the cat had died. We felt badly indeed, yet that night Jane insisted upon holding the 837th session. The events of our lives keep on unfolding. On the next day, March the 1st, the page proofs for Seth's Psyche arrived from the publisher. But we could see that going over that much shorter book would be easy compared to our protracted labors for Volume 2 of Unknown Reality. The day after that, a dear friend brought us two 6-week-old kittens, litter mates fresh from a nearby farm. At once Jane and I named them Billy 2 and Mitzi. Billy 2, obviously, because he was also a tiger cat and bore a strong resemblance to the dead Billy. Mitzi, because with her longer black and white fur, she at once reminded me of the Mitzi who'd belonged to the Butts' next-door neighbor when I was a child. The two cats had lived only in a gloomy barn so far, and were so shy they hid under our living room couch for several days. On March the 5th, the four matter proofs for Volume 2, consisting of items like the table of contents, a poem of Jane's, the titles of her previous books, and so forth, arrived for checking. We expect to see the proofs for Volume 2's index in a couple of weeks. I'm going to skip down. Now for my question about viruses referred to earlier in these notes. What, I wrote for the 836th session, is the real relationship between the host organism and disease? Recently, Jane and I talked about the evident worldwide eradication of smallpox, as announced earlier this month. WHO, the World Health Organization, and wondered if the disease has truly been eliminated. WHO won't officially declare smallpox done away with for a year or so, while waiting to see if any new cases surface. Or would smallpox appear again, say 10 years from now? Obviously, I said to Jane more than once, if an entity smallpox could think as we do, it would hardly consider itself bad, or such an awful disease or scourge. If it was so terrible, why did it ever exist within nature's framework to begin with? What was its role in the whole panoply of life forms? Could the disease even move from whatever probability it now occupies back into our own reality someday, thus appearing to have regenerated itself? What would we humans say if that happened? Smallpox reappearance would undoubtedly be rationalized. It had laid hidden or dormant in some uninvestigated pocket of humanity, or it was a mutation somehow evolving into smallpox from one of the closely related animal poxes. In that same session, Seth gave these responses, among others, to my questions. All viruses are of any kind are important to the stability of your planetary life. They are part of the planet's biological heritage and memory. You cannot eradicate a virus, though at any given time you destroy every member alive of its given strain. They exist in the Earth's memory to be recreated as they were before, whenever the need arises. The same applies, of course, to any animal or plant considered extinct. Only an objectively tuned consciousness like man's would imagine that the physical eradication of a species destroys its existence. Seth also touched upon the question while dealing mainly with Billy's death in the next 3 sessions, which are also private, but this evening he was more specific. Even though he didn't call this the 840th session book dictation, we're presenting part of it here because the material fits in so well with his themes for mass events. And now for the session. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. You could not live without viruses, nor could your biological reality as you know it now exist. Viruses appear to be the bad guys, and as a rule you think of them separately, as for example the smallpox virus. There are overall affiliations in which viruses take part, however, in which delicate balances are maintained biologically. Each body contains countless viruses that could be deadly at any given time and under certain conditions. These, and I am putting it as simply as possible, take turns being active or inactive within the body, in accordance with the body's overall condition. Viruses that are deadly in certain stages are not in others, and in those latter stages they react biologically in quite beneficial ways, adding to the body's stability by bringing about necessary changes, say, in cellular activities that are helpful, given rates of action. These in turn trigger other cellular changes, again of a beneficial nature. As an example from another field, consider poisons. Belladonna can be quite deadly, yet small doses of it were known to aid the body in disease conditions. Give us a moment. The viruses in the body have a social, cooperative existence. Their effects become deadly only under certain conditions. The viruses must be triggered into destructive activity, and this happens only at a certain point when the individual involved is actively seeking either death or a crisis situation biologically. The initial contagion in such cases is always emotional and mental. Social conditions are usually involved, so that an individual is, say, at the lower end of a poor social environment, a seeming victim of it, or in a situation where his individual value as a social member is severely weakened. Now, in the same way that a member of such a society can go blow his stack, go overboard, commit antisocial acts, so in the same fashion such a person can instead trigger the viruses, wreck their biological social order, so that some of them suddenly become deadly or run amok. So of course the resulting diseases are infections. To that degree they are social diseases. It is not so much that a virus, say, suddenly turns destructive, though it does, as it is that the entire cooperative structure within which all the viruses are involved becomes insecure and threatened. I told you in the private session 836 that viruses mutate. Such is often the case. It seems quite scientific to believe in inoculations against such dangerous diseases. And certainly, scientifically, inoculations seem to work. People in your time right now are not plagued by smallpox, for example. Some cultures have believed that illnesses were caused by demons. Medicine men, through certain ceremonies, would try to rid the body of the demons, and those methods worked also. The belief system was tight and accepted, and it only began to fail when those societies encountered civilized views. If you call the demon's negative beliefs, however, then you have taken strides forward. People continue to die of disease. Many of your scientific procedures, including inoculations, of themselves cause new diseases. It does not help a patient inoculated against smallpox and polio if eventually he dies of cancer as a result of his negative beliefs. Give us a moment. What I have said about viruses applies to all biological life. Viruses are highly intelligent, meaning that they react quickly to stimuli. They are responsive to emotional states. They are social. Their scale of life varies considerably, and some can be inactive for centuries and revive. They have extensive memory patterns, biologically imprinted. Some can multiply in the tens of thousands within seconds. They are in many ways the basis of biological life, but you are aware of them only when they show a deadly face. You are not aware of the inner army of viruses within the body that protect it constantly. Host and virus both need each other, and both are part of the same life cycle. Now give us a moment. One brief note. Rupert was momentarily upset before the session, cranky. He thought he did not feel like having a session to try to solve the world's problems. He just wanted to watch television and forget it all. And hidden in that crankiness is a good point. The sessions are an expression of your private and joint curiosity, a high and excellent curiosity about the nature of reality, a result of your desire to know whether or not the knowledge can be held in your hands like a fruit, whether or not the knowledge can be dosed out to an ailing world as medicine. I surely understand that you want to make the knowledge practical in the physical world and to help people as much as you can. But that cannot be the only goal, for that goal must always be the high personal exploration of consciousness, the creative and artistic pursuit for which there may be no name. You do not make shoes to put on people's feet. You do not make deodorants to stop perspiration. If you did either of these things, you could see material results at once. People with shoes of your making, and people who did not sweat. In parentheses, such deodorants are highly disadvantageously incidentally. You are not dealing with material specifics or even with the psychic specifics. You are dealing instead with the initiation of a framework of beliefs far better than those now current. A framework that is large enough to contain all specifics through which people can indeed learn to understand themselves better. You are providing an overall aura of spiritual and intellectual light, which would help people precisely because you are not tied to specifics, but engaged with the larger levels of reality from which these specifics emerge. Give us a moment. After a long pause, Seth launched into a good bit of material that was outside of any related to his subject matter for mass events. He said good night. Notes. We were shocked because Billy's unexpected and serious illness reminded us of the almost universally accepted view that life is terribly vulnerable. Any kind of life. Billy was a replacement for our previous cat, Willie, who died in November. And we'd found him at an animal shelter the next weekend after Willie's death. As far as having a pet to love went, we'd thought ourselves set for a number of years. At first we'd called the newcomer Willie too, but soon automatically shortened that to Billy. During the 836th session, Seth reminded us that animals do not think of long lives or short lives, but of a brilliant present, which in a way, compared to your framework, has no beginning or end. Time, in your terms, does not exist for them. And in the deepest of terms, the life's quality on a human scale cannot be judged primarily in terms of its length either. I might add here another insight into the relationship between Jane and Seth, the kind of information we continue to search for. Before holding the 836th session, Jane had found herself mourning the possibility that Billy might die. From Seth, she then picked up material to the effect that time was in the present to the cat. In a way, its life was eternal to it, whether it lived 10 months or 10 years or whatever. At the time, she wrote later for me, emotionally, she objected strenuously to that message of Seth's, since it seemed too easy a way to sign off a cat's life, or any other life, even if it was true. And I did accept that it was true, or as close to the truth as we could get. Years ago, such spontaneous objections of mine really bothered me, she continued, and I'd sit and mentally argue with Seth so that the session didn't begin right away. It only started after I mentally shut up. Rob said I'd never told him this before when I mentioned it as we got ready for the 836th session. It just had never occurred to me, I guess. In the 837th session, Seth dealt mostly with Billy's death. It wasn't that the loss of just a cat was the only something involved in our deep upsets. Although Billy's death came first in our reactions, we also felt a host of emotional and intellectual ramifications arising from that event. We still couldn't believe Billy was gone for good. This effect was heightened because we had no body to prove his death to us. I hadn't gone after him. The ground was frozen, so I couldn't bury him in the backyard beside Willie, and the veterinarian had agreed to dispose of the remains for us. We'd felt the same way when Willie had died 3 years earlier, and now, as she had then, Jane said sadly, if I could answer our question about that cat's death, maybe I could answer our questions about everything. We're still trying to get answers with the help of the Seth material. I don't mind noting that I think that with Seth, Jane has achieved some understanding of our species' larger questions about life and death. Seth went into those questions while talking about Billy in session 837, but his material is much too long to print in mass events, and even too long to touch upon the highlights in any adequate way. There follows a few quotations from the material he gave us in those private sessions, however. We hope they'll indicate some of the directions his answers took about those intimate challenges that concern us all. From session 837, held on the evening of the day Billy died. My dear friends, existence is larger than life or death. Life and death are both states of existence. An identity exists whether it is in the state of life or in the state of death. Your cat's consciousness never was dependent upon its physical form. Instead, the consciousness was itself choosing the experience of cathood. There was nothing that said this consciousness must be a cat. Billy belonged in another probability, and in a fashion, you switched probabilities for him, though without his consent, when you took him from the animal shelter, where he would have soon been done away with. His 3 years with you represented a grace period for him. He did not make this probability his own because of what you may call other commitments, or rather other purposes. There is no such thing as a cat consciousness, basically speaking, or a bird consciousness. In those terms, there are instead simply consciousnesses that choose to take certain focuses. We have not touched upon some of these matters, and some are again most difficult to explain, as we wish to avoid distortions. These would have nothing to do with Rupert, but simply the way you put concepts together at this stage of development. I want to avoid tales of the transmigration of the souls of men to animals, say, a badly distorted version of something else entirely. If there's no consciousness tailored to be a cat's or a dog's, then there is no prepackaged predestined particular consciousness that is meant to be human either. You both knew Billy was about to die. So did the plants in your house and the trees outside your door. The cellular announcement was made that the strong possibility existed for the birth and death of each cell is known to all cells in the world. Cellular communication is too fast for you to follow. The cat could have changed his mind, of course, but the signals were sent out and ahead of time. Several people who wrote to you picked up on that probability. With some amazement, Jane and I had noticed this in letters we received from both friends and strangers during the days immediately following Billy's death. The quality of identity is far more mysterious than you understand, for you assign an identity in a blanket fashion, say, to each living thing. Now your dead cat, Billy, exists in the following manner. The units of consciousness that organized to form his identity as you knew it still form that pattern, but not physically. The cat exists as itself in the greater living memory of its own larger selfhood. Its organization, the cat's, exists inviolably, but as a part of the greater psychic organization from which it came. That identity of Billy's remains vital, known to itself whether or not it is reactivated in your terms. This is not necessarily always the case, and there is great variation. But Billy identified with the larger organization of the litter, that is, with his brothers and sisters, all of whom are also dead, and the consciousnesses of that litter are now together. They are forming a gestate, where the 5 consciousnesses will merge to form a new identity. On separate days, both Jane and I had vivid psychic experiences involving our perception of Billy not long after his death. Each in our own way we saw him larger than life, performing with amazing vitality and grace. In my own case, the experience was so vivid as to be almost frightening. Jane hopes to use both events, plus some material she wrote on specific experimentation with animals in one of her own books. And in closing, the index for Volume 2 of Unknown Reality will contain a comprehensive list of references to Seth's discussions of his units of consciousness, or CUs, as presented in both volumes of that work. Belladonna is a perennial herb native to Europe. Extracts made from it contains the alkaloid atropine, among others, which is used to relieve muscle spasm and to dilate the pupil of the eye for optical surgery. It's interesting to note also that in medieval Europe, larger amounts of those extracts were used as hallucinogens by witches and members of other cults. Okay, now, this session is long enough, so I will end it now and take up this new part of session 841 in the next. This is the Dove Lady, over and out for now.